The summer of 1945 had left Japan in ruin. Entire cities lay flattened. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, nothing but smoke, ash, and hollow echoes of lives once ordinary. In the countryside, families searched the rubble for loved ones who never returned. Yet among the endless grief, one story would ripple through the shattered heart of Japan, an encounter between victors and the defeated that defied everything war was supposed to be. At dawn, the mist over Kyushu clung low, a silent shroud over scorched villages. American troops moved cautiously down narrow dirt roads, still lined with burnt-out trucks and collapsed farmhouses. The men were battle-hardened veterans of the Pacific campaign, trained to expect ambushes, snipers, hidden mines. Every rustle in the tall grass sent hands to rifle grips. But that morning, the sound that froze them was not a gunshot. It was the faint cry of a child. Two soldiers advanced toward the sound. What they found would stop them cold. A small boy, no older than 6, barefoot, his kimono torn and blackened with soot. He clutched a wooden toy, its paint chipped, its wheels missing. He did not run. He simply stared, eyes wide, too hungry and too tired to be afraid. Behind him lay what once had been a home, now a heap of burned bamboo and shattered tile. The soldiers exchanged glances. This was not the war they had been trained for. They radioed back to base, reporting a lost civilian child, unarmed. Orders came through to bring him in. When the boy was lifted into a jeep, he did not resist. He sat silently, staring out at the countryside that had become unrecognizable. To the Americans, he was just one among thousands displaced by the bombings. But to the mothers searching the ruins, every missing child was the world. As the U.S. occupation began, humanitarian work fell to the same soldiers who had once fought their way island by island across the Pacific. Military government teams were tasked with restoring order, food distribution, disease control, rebuilding local administration. Yet amid those operations, an unspoken mission emerged, reuniting the lost. For every orphaned or separated child, soldiers took notes, translated names, compared fragments of memory against local records. It was chaos turned into compassion. In a makeshift field hospital outside Hiroshima, another group of soldiers discovered 3 girls wandering near a destroyed bridge. They carried a tattered photograph of their mother, folded 100 times over. The image was barely visible, the faces blurred. A young American medic carefully cleaned their wounds, then sent a message through local interpreters. Days later, a Japanese woman arrived, limping, her arms trembling as she saw her daughters alive. Witnesses said she fell to her knees and wept uncontrollably, while the soldiers stood back, unsure whether to approach or simply bear witness. The moment needed no translation. What made these reunions remarkable was not merely their emotional weight, but the context. Only weeks earlier, both sides had been locked in a brutal fight to the death. Propaganda had painted each as monsters. Japanese civilians had been told that Americans would slaughter them on sight. American troops had been warned that the Japanese would rather die than surrender. Yet when face to face with hungry children and desperate mothers, humanity overrode hatred. In some villages, U.S. patrols were met not with hostility, but with hesitant trust. Locals began whispering that the Americans carried chocolate and milk powder, that they treated the sick without asking for payment. A Marine sergeant recalled how villagers approached him holding a torn kimono. Inside it, a name written in brushstroke ink. They begged him to help find the missing girl. For days, he used the unit's jeep to search nearby shelters until he found her. When he returned her home, the mother bowed so deeply her forehead touched the ground. The sergeant, unsure how to respond, simply saluted. Stories spread faster than orders. Japanese mothers began to approach American checkpoints not with fear, but with cautious hope. They brought fragments of photographs, small sandals, family crests painted on scraps of fabric. Soldiers who had once advanced under enemy fire now knelt in the dirt beside them, comparing notes, asking for names. It was as if the entire island had transformed into one vast search party for lost innocence. For the American troops, these encounters left lasting impressions. Many had seen unimaginable horrors. Tarawa, Saipan, Okinawa. They had watched comrades die in jungles and on beaches, hardened by the brutality of total war. Yet here, amid ashes and orphans, they rediscovered something the war had nearly extinguished: empathy. Letters home began to change in tone. No longer filled with anger or vengeance, they spoke of the little ones, of mothers who smiled through tears, of a people trying to live again. One evening in the village of Shimonoseki, a group of GIs escorted a handful of children to a temporary shelter, set up in an abandoned school. The walls still bore bullet holes. On the chalkboard, someone had written in English and Japanese, "Children reunited here." Mothers gathered outside, holding candles as the last light faded. One by one, names were read aloud. With each recognition, there were cries, sobs, embraces that blurred the line between conqueror and conquered. Even the soldiers looked away, struggling to contain the emotion. But for every child found, many remained missing. Rivers had carried some away. Fires had erased entire families. In those moments, soldiers could offer only quiet company, a blanket or the simple act of listening. And sometimes that was enough. It reminded survivors that compassion had not been completely destroyed by war. The U.S. occupation authorities soon recognized the power of these acts. Reports began circulating among military units, accounts of soldiers aiding civilians, reuniting families, preventing chaos. These small gestures did more to stabilize regions than any order or patrol could achieve. Commanders encouraged cooperation with local leaders, emphasizing dignity over dominance. It was a subtle but profound shift in policy, one born not from strategy, but from shared humanity. By late autumn, as Japan's surrender gave way to rebuilding, the emotional scars remained deep. Yet within that devastation, stories of reunion continued to emerge. A mother in Nagasaki, who thought her son perished beneath the mushroom cloud, discovered him weeks later at an American-run clinic, alive, scarred, but smiling. A U.S. interpreter recounted how she whispered through tears, "I thought God had taken everything." The soldier had no words. He simply placed the child's hand in hers and stepped back. War had separated them. Compassion brought them back together. But this story was not yet over. For behind the humanitarian acts lay a quiet struggle among the soldiers themselves, men grappling with guilt, trauma and disbelief that they, the invaders, had become the protectors of their former enemies' children. What began as duty was transforming into something deeper, a reconciliation born in the ashes of war, and in the next phase of Japan's occupation, that transformation would take on an unexpected form, when American soldiers and Japanese civilians began working side by side to rebuild not just homes, but trust itself. When Japan's surrender became official on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the world expected vengeance. The Pacific War had been one of annihilation. Cities burned, soldiers mutilated, civilians driven to suicide. Yet the reality that unfolded across Japan in the following months was something no one had predicted. Instead of revenge, the occupation force led by General Douglas MacArthur began orchestrating one of history's largest humanitarian reconstructions. It was a mission carried out not just with policy, but with compassion, by men who only weeks earlier had been trained to kill. Behind the scenes, the U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division established field offices in every prefecture. Their job was simple in theory, but monumental in practice: maintain order, feed millions, and prevent collapse. But within that massive effort, one particular unit took on a deeply human task: the War Orphans Repatriation Program. Using improvised records, local teachers, and interpreters, soldiers tracked missing children across destroyed railways, shattered villages, and burned urban grids. To the astonishment of Japanese mothers, it worked. The logistics were staggering. Military engineers reactivated Japan's crippled communication lines, patching telephone circuits with leftover field wire from combat stockpiles. Supply convoys that once carried ammunition were now filled with milk, medicine, and blankets. Jeeps were repurposed into ambulances, their olive paint still scarred by shrapnel. Even aircraft played a role. C-47 transports, once used to drop paratroopers, now ferried children and supplies between islands. Mechanics at depots who had once repaired tanks now worked on generators to keep orphan shelters warm through the approaching winter. Many of the American soldiers involved were volunteers. Corporal Robert H. Thomas of the 8th Army, who had fought in the Philippines, later wrote that he could not reconcile the faces of the Japanese mothers with the enemy we had fought. Others admitted that the humanitarian work helped silence their own ghosts. The soldiers' hands that once carried rifles now carried children, and for many, that became a kind of redemption. To the Japanese, these actions were unthinkable. For years, wartime propaganda had taught them that Americans were beasts who would destroy everything sacred. Civilians had been issued grenades for mass suicide if captured. Yet as days passed, villagers saw American soldiers giving rations to children first, taking none for themselves. A woman in Shizuoka recalled watching a young GI kneel beside a starving boy and hand him his only chocolate bar. "I knew then," she said, "that the war was truly over." The cooperation that grew from these moments changed the course of the occupation. Japanese police officers, who had once served under the imperial regime, began working alongside American MPs. Teachers opened schoolhouses as registration centers for missing children. Even Buddhist monks volunteered temple grounds for temporary shelters. The effort transcended language. Gestures replaced words. Soldiers used sketches and maps to communicate names and locations, learning fragments of Japanese from local interpreters. Slowly, the fear that had defined the Pacific began to dissolve, yet the scale of devastation remained immense. By 1946, the Ministry of Health estimated over 120,000 displaced children across the main islands. Many had lost both parents during air raids or were separated during evacuation trains. Some had forgotten their names. To organize reunification, U.S. forces introduced a simple but revolutionary system: photographic registries. Soldiers photographed each found child, printing copies in makeshift darkrooms, then distributing them to nearby towns through local radio stations. It was primitive, but it worked. Within weeks, hundreds of families were reunited. In the ruins of Yokohama, a marine communications team discovered a group of boys hiding in an abandoned factory. They were thin, frightened, but disciplined. They bowed when approached. When questioned through an interpreter, the eldest said they were waiting for their mother, who had promised to return after finding food. The Marines set up camp nearby, leaving rations each morning. On the fifth day, a woman appeared on the horizon, limping. She saw the Americans first, then her sons. The reunion unfolded in silence, punctuated only by sobs. A Marine sergeant watching later wrote that he had never seen anything braver than a mother walking through a battlefield to find her children. American military photographers documented these reunions for reports and internal briefings. The images, however, quickly became symbols of the occupation's softer side. They showed soldiers cradling infants, escorting mothers through rubble, or helping children rebuild toy boats from scrap wood. These were not propaganda. They were spontaneous acts that revealed how human instinct can overcome ideology. Many photos were later exhibited in Tokyo and Washington, changing how both nations viewed each other. Technology, too, became an unlikely bridge. The Signal Corps, responsible for wartime communications, redirected its technical skill to humanitarian purposes. Engineers who once managed encrypted battlefield transmissions now built radio networks, broadcasting lost person announcements in Japanese. Messages were short and repetitive, naming children, parents, and last known locations. Local residents gathered nightly around speakers, hoping to recognize a voice or a name. For some, it was the only remaining link to their past. Even industrial giants contributed. General Electric and Motorola, whose wartime production lines had built field radios, donated spare components to help power these networks. American and Japanese technicians collaborated in the ruins of Tokyo's broadcast station, rebuilding transmitters by candlelight. The process symbolized what peace could look like when built on cooperation instead of conquest. But amid the compassion, tragedy lingered. Not every reunion ended in joy. Some mothers arrived only to find graves or unidentifiable remains. American chaplains often stood beside them, offering silent prayer. One Catholic priest attached to the Eighth Army remembered a woman who bowed to him and whispered, "Thank you for helping me find where he sleeps." For the soldiers, moments like these carried more weight than any medal. The most extraordinary reunion took place near Kure, a naval town once home to Japan's mighty battleship fleet. There, an American patrol located a group of orphans living inside a half-sunken warehouse by the harbor. Among them was a toddler wearing a sailor's cap, far too large for his head. When news spread, a woman arrived, claiming the child as her own. The soldiers hesitated, unsure of verification, but when she sang a lullaby, the boy ran into her arms. Witnesses recalled that even the hardened Marines turned away, pretending to check their weapons. Stories like these reached MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo. The Supreme Commander, aware of the delicate balance between occupation and reconciliation, authorized the continuation of these civilian aid operations. He publicly stated that the measure of victory is not destruction but the restoration of humanity. Under his directive, schools reopened, food distribution expanded, and the search for displaced families became an official mission. The shift was not purely sentimental, it had strategic value. By demonstrating compassion, the U.S. occupation forces pacified potential uprisings, stabilized regions faster, and laid the groundwork for long-term partnership. But for the soldiers on the ground, it was simpler than politics. They saw suffering and acted. Many later said that those months in Japan taught them more about peace than years of war ever had. As 1946 turned into 1947, Japan's reconstruction accelerated. Railways reopened, children returned to classrooms, and for the first time in years, laughter echoed through the streets. Yet for every rebuilt school stood a memory of the soldiers who had helped find its students. And for every mother who held her child again, there remained an indelible understanding that mercy could emerge even from the deepest wounds of war. What began as scattered acts of compassion had become a quiet revolution. Soldiers and civilians who once faced each other through guns were now rebuilding the same nation, piece by piece. But beneath that newfound peace lay a question that haunted both sides. Could such humanity survive the weight of memory? The answer would unfold in the years to come, as children who had been saved by American soldiers grew up to shape a new Japan, one that would remember not only the devastation of war, but the mercy that followed it. By the spring of 1947, Japan was awakening from the nightmare. Fields once blackened by fire now sprouted rice again. The sound of hammers echoed through cities that had forgotten construction. Yet behind the machinery of recovery, the emotional landscape was far more complex. The memories of war lingered like smoke, present even in clear skies. For American soldiers and Japanese civilians alike, the reunions of mothers and lost children had become something larger than isolated moments of compassion. They had turned into the foundation of reconciliation, a psychological turning point in modern warfare. For many Japanese families, the shock was not only that their children had survived, but that their rescuers were the very men they had been taught to hate. Mothers told stories to neighbors in hushed disbelief, how uniformed soldiers had handed them their sons, how they had bowed in respect before leaving. In a society where shame and loss had once defined surrender, these acts restored dignity. Psychologists later observed that such encounters helped diffuse collective trauma, allowing communities to rebuild trust faster than any political decree could. In U.S. military circles, reports of these reunions circulated widely. Officers recognized that compassion was achieving what weapons never could, winning the peace. Morale among occupation troops improved. The soldiers, burdened by the ghosts of battle, found purpose in helping rather than destroying. Chaplains organized letter drives between American families and Japanese orphans, creating connections that stretched across oceans. What began as a mission of reconstruction became a quiet spiritual redemption for both nations. The broader strategic impact was profound. As Japan's infrastructure recovered, its population, especially the younger generation, began to view Americans not as conquerors, but as protectors. Schools reopened with U.S. aid. Teachers taught English using donated books. Children who had once been rescued now waved at passing jeeps, calling out the few English words they knew. Soldiers responded with smiles, sometimes tossing candy from ration kits. It was a small gesture, but in those moments the image of the American soldier changed forever. Behind this transformation stood a complex network of logistics and policy. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, established welfare offices dedicated to reuniting families and assisting orphans. Japanese social workers were trained by American administrators, creating one of the earliest modern child welfare systems in Asia. Photographic registries evolved into national identification archives. Local radio stations expanded the missing person broadcasts, pioneered by the Signal Corps. forming the backbone of Japan's post-war public communication system. Each technical innovation carried an emotional weight far greater than its wires or circuits suggested. It represented connection, safety, and renewal. Industrial cooperation deepened the effect. Factories that had once built Zero fighters or artillery shells were converted to manufacture bicycles, stoves, and school furniture. American engineers supervised production, ensuring quality and safety. These joint efforts symbolized something radical for the time. A former enemy nation, now rebuilding with the guidance of its conqueror, not under chains, but under shared purpose. For Japanese mothers, the return of their children and the reopening of schools were visible proof that life could begin again. For American soldiers, it was a living reminder that victory without mercy meant nothing. In Tokyo, photographers continued documenting reunions for archives. One famous image showed a mother holding her child, while an American soldier stood a few steps back, smiling faintly. The caption read simply, "Peace returns." The picture circulated in magazines across both countries. In the United States, it softened the harsh image of the Pacific War. In Japan, it reminded survivors that compassion existed even in defeat. Historians later credited these images with shaping early post-war diplomacy and the remarkable absence of prolonged insurgency during occupation. But not every story was publicized. Many soldiers carried their experiences quietly, long after they returned home. Letters from veterans decades later revealed the lasting emotional toll and healing that came from those days. One wrote, "I went to Japan expecting hatred. I left remembering only gratitude." Another recalled finding a child beneath a collapsed bridge and carrying him for miles. "That boy gave me back my humanity," he confessed. For the Japanese, gratitude turned into determination. Women whose children had been saved became volunteers in orphan relief centers. Communities rebuilt temples and shrines not for worship alone, but as memorials to reconciliation. Even local festivals began to include tributes to the helpers from afar, blending cultural memory with acts of collective gratitude. The simple act of returning a lost child had reshaped an entire nation's relationship with its occupiers. The psychological implications extended beyond Japan. American military strategists studied the occupation's success as a model for future operations. They concluded that humanitarian engagement, especially direct aid to families, was a force multiplier more effective than intimidation. In later decades, from Korea to Iraq, the lessons drawn from Japan's post-war recovery informed U.S. military doctrine: win hearts to secure stability. Yet few remembered that this strategy had been born not in a war room, but in a soldier's decision to kneel beside a frightened child in the ashes of a burned village. By 1950, many of those children were attending newly rebuilt schools. Some of the American soldiers who had once rescued them returned as teachers or engineers under civilian contracts. Friendships endured. Exchanges of letters and photos continued for years. The children of war grew into Japan's post-war generation, the architects, teachers, and leaders who would rebuild their nation into an economic powerhouse. Many later said they never forgot the faces of the soldiers who had carried them to safety. And for the mothers, time did not erase the memory of that first reunion. Some kept the ration cans or blankets given to them as keepsakes. Others placed the names of American soldiers on family altars, honoring them in prayer as protectors. In a culture deeply tied to ancestry, this gesture carried immense meaning. It marked the former enemy as part of the spirit of home. The legacy of those acts still lingers today. In museums and memorials across Japan, small exhibits quietly tell of post-war compassion. A soldier's helmet filled with candies for children, a photograph of a GI teaching a child to write his name, a mother's note thanking an unknown American angel. These fragments form a different kind of history, one written not in treaties or weapons, but in kindness. As historians reflect on the Pacific War, they often focus on battles, strategies, and casualties. Yet beneath those vast statistics lies a truth that transcends time. The ultimate measure of civilization is not how fiercely it fights, but how gently it rebuilds. When American soldiers carried Japanese children back to their mothers, they did more than mend families. They restored humanity itself. In the decades that followed, Japan and the United States forged an alliance that became one of the strongest in modern history. Trade flourished, cultures intertwined, and the scars of war slowly turned into bridges of understanding. Few could have imagined in 1945 that these two nations would one day stand as partners. Yet the seeds of that transformation were sown in the simplest of gestures, a hand extended to a lost child. One veteran, interviewed in the twilight of his life, was asked what he remembered most from the war. He paused for a long time, eyes distant, then said quietly, "Not the battles. The children, the way their mothers looked at us, not with fear but with forgiveness. That's when I knew we had truly won." The war had begun in hatred and ended in fire, but what endured was compassion. In the ruins of empire, and under the watch of the occupying army, mothers wept, children smiled, and soldiers discovered that mercy could be stronger than any weapon. It was not written in history books as a campaign or an operation. Yet for those who lived it, it was the greatest victory of all, the victory of humanity over war.